I am presenting Union Gospel Press Sunday School Lesson number 3, Sunday, June 20th, 2021. Happy Father's Day. The lesson is entitled, Jonathan Attacks the Philistine Outpost. Lesson text comes from 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 1 through 13. Related scriptures are 1 Samuel 13, 15 through 23, and 14, 14 through 23. Psalms 33, 12 through 22, 135, 5 through 7, Romans 8, 31 through 39. The places is Gibeah, and the pass at Mishmash. The time is 1041 BC. How confident are you in the Lord's ability to work in your life? Do you believe he can do anything, or do you waver in doubt? What separates those who do great things for the Lord from those who live in mediocrity or even fertility? In a word, faith. Those who have faith in Christ are the ones who enjoy victory over the hardships life throws at them. This does not mean they are free from struggles and hard times. Far from it. It does, however, mean that they persevere in faith and overcome their circumstances. This week's lesson shows that people of faith are also people of valor. They are not always noticed or applauded, but they do come out on top. It is a mistake to think that people of faith do not go through trials and tragedies. Sometimes they even have their faith shaken. However, those who face the enemy with courage and faith will be triumphant in the end and receive their reward from their King. Today's aim, facts. To illustrate that victory in our lives requires faith and perseverance in the Lord. Principle, to teach that God always honors those who are willing to stand up against the enemy in his name. Application, to stress the need to rely always on the Lord's strength and not our own. Illustrating the lesson. Jonathan's victory over the Philistines illustrates that our spiritual victories in life come through faith in the Lord and dependence on his strength. Practical points. 1. Acting in faith often requires a believer to leave the crowd behind. 1 Samuel 14:1. 2. Fear leaves us vulnerable and oblivious to God's plan, verses 2 through 3. 3. God gives boldness to those who know the battle belongs to him, verses 4 through 6. 4. God gives loyal and faithful companions to walk with us on the journey of faith, verse 7. 5. Moving forward in faith means that believers listen for God and follow his lead, verses 8 through 10. 6. God brings great victory from even small steps of faith in him, verses 11 through 13. Golden text. And Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, Come and let us go over. For there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. 1 Samuel 14:6. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is a secret reconnaissance, coming from 1 Samuel 14, 1 through 5. The second is an audacious plan, 1 Samuel 14, 6 through 10. And the third is a conclusive victory, 1 Samuel 14, 11 through 13. Introduction. One man with God is a majority. This saying has become so well known and so popular that it is almost a cliche. The sentiment has been attributed to any number of sources. More important than who first said it is how much those who repeat the saying really believe it. If we are honest, most of us probably file this statement away in the category of comforting thoughts, and that is the end of it. King Saul's oldest son, Jonathan, was not one who allowed the idea behind this phrase to remain a comforting thought and no more. For him, it was the basis for going out and doing God's will, even or perhaps especially when his will involved peril, to life and limb. Jonathan was a man who lived out God's truth. A secret reconnaissance. 1 Samuel 14:1. Now it came to pass upon a day that Jonathan the son of Saul said unto the young man that bare his armor, Come, and let us go over to the Philistines' garnison that is on the other side, that he told not his father. Verse 2. And Saul tarried in the uppermost part of Gibeah, under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron, and the people that were with him were about 600 men. And Ahiah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, and the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people knew not that Jonathan was gone. Verse 4. And between the passages by which Jonathan sought to go over unto the Philistines' garnison, there was a sharp rock on the one side, and a sharp rock on the other side. And the name of the one rock was Bozez, and the name of the other Shana. Verse 5. The forefront of the one was situate northward over against Mishma, and the other southward over against Gibeah. As today's text opens, we find the Israelites under King Saul threatened by an overwhelming number of their Philistine enemies. This massive force had so panicked Saul that it led to his first major act of disobedience to the Lord, the decision to offer a sacrifice on his own. 1 Samuel 13:5-12. That lapse of faith would eventually cost him his kingdom. Verses 13-14. But for now, the Philistine threat still had to be faced. The Philistines had gathered in a force at Michmash on Israel's central north-south ridge, verse 5, and remained there after Samuel left Saul at Gilgal, verses 15-16. Saul and his men made their way back to his hometown of Gibeah, less than 5 miles southwest of Michmash. Philistine raids in various directions continued, verse 17, and the Israelite situation was especially dire with an acute shortage of weaponry, verses 18-22. Things looked bleak for Saul and his men. It was at this point that Saul's son Jonathan undertook an unexpected action that would prove decisive in turning the picture from gloom to glory. The military situation. 1 Samuel 14:1-3. The last verse of chapter 13 notes that the Philistine sent a small detachment to man an outpost at the pass close by Michmash. This outpost guarded a narrow approach from the east through a steep ravine. Although Saul and his men were now in Gibeah, the Philistines apparently were taking no chances at being approached by any forces, however small, still left in the Jordan Valley to the east. But the Philistine garrison had not escaped Jonathan's notice. Indeed, it aroused his curiosity. One day he suggested to his young armor-bearer that the two of them go check it out. The outpost was on the other side, that is, on the far side of the steep ravine. Significantly, Jonathan did not tell his father what he was proposing to do. The writer is careful to note again that Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah, camped under a pomegranate tree in Migron. 600 men were still with him. A further parenthetical comment observes that among these was Ahiah, more commonly spelled Ahijah, the great-grandson of the high priest Eli, who had served at Shiloh. Ahijah was wearing the priestly ephod. The implication is that Saul would be offering no more unauthorized sacrifices because he was accompanied by a designated priest. More significantly, for events yet to come, it is stressed that no one in Saul's camp knew that Jonathan had departed. The challenge of the terrain. 1 Samuel 14:4-5. The path Jonathan chose for his reconnaissance mission was not an easy one. He could have crossed a wide pass farther to the west, but he chose a more difficult route that encountered the ravine and its cliffs, each called a sharp rock in verse 4 to the east. To reach the Philistine outpost, Jonathan had to descend one cliff, a sharp rock, and climb the opposite one. These cliffs were formidable enough to be given names, Bozaz and Shana. The meanings of these names are uncertain, but the cliffs must have been quite impressive for the names to be remembered. Verse 5 provides the further detail that the cliff on the north side of the ravine stood in front of Michmash, while the southern cliff stood on the way to Gibeah. No doubt these facts help orient generations of Israelite hearers of this story to the particular geography involved. And they confirm for us the detailed historical of the biblical text. An audacious plan, verse 6. And Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, Come and let us go over unto the garnison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. Verse 7. And his armor bearer said unto him, Do all that is in thine heart, turn thee. Behold, I am with thee according to thy heart. Verse 8. Then said Jonathan, Behold, we will pass over unto these men, and we will discover ourselves unto them. Verse 9. If they say thus unto us, Tarry until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up unto them. Verse 10. But if they say thus, Come up unto us, then we will go up, for the Lord have delivered them into our hands, and this shall be a sign unto us. Jonathan's bold suggestion for 1 Samuel 14:6-7. Jonathan was not content to merely gather intelligence on the Philistine garnison. Indeed, they may never have been his main intention. In any case, when they came within sight of the outpost, presumably from the top of the southern cliff, he made his aim clear. Jonathan suggested to his armor bearer that they go across and pay the uncircumcised garnish a visit. He wanted a confrontation. Jonathan's next words in verse 6 makes clear what he intended and reveal his robust faith. It may be that the Lord will work for us. His use of may be does not indicate doubt in God's ability, but rather shows a mature faith that avoids presumption. Jonathan could not claim absolutely that the Lord was going to fight for them, for he had not been commanded to undertake this mission. He may have felt confidence that the Lord had put the idea in his heart, but he was leaving room for God's will to be done as he saw fit. Undergirding Jonathan's optimistic outlook on the situation was a bedrock conviction. There is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. Numbers meant nothing to Jonathan. He surely knew the history of his people, particularly how with only 300 men, Gideon was enabled by God to defeat a Midianite army of 135,000. Judges 7:8-10. In the present case, just 2 men faced the Philistine detachment of unknown number. They had to know they were greatly outnumbered, but it did not matter. God's involvement was the deciding factor. The young man who served as Jonathan's armor bearer may not have possessed the same degree of conviction as Jonathan, but he had sufficient faith to agree to the plan without flinching. We read of no attempt to get Jonathan to rethink his idea. There is no whiff of reluctance or even hesitation. The young man replied simply that Jonathan should do all that was in his heart and that he was fully with him in it. What a brave and encouraging offer of support. Jonathan's tactical appraisal. 1 Samuel 14, 8 through 10. Having secured his companion's commitment, Jonathan proceeded to lay out a brief plan of action. It was quite simple, really. Jonathan proposed that they cross the ravine. We will pass over unto these men, verse 8, and let the Philistines catch sight of them. We will discover ourselves unto them. From what immediately follows, it appears that he expected to be spotted when they reached the bottom of the ravine. They may have sought to cover on the way down and then planned to stand out in the open on the valley floor. When this stage was reached, the next step for the two men depended on the response of the enemy. Jonathan envisioned two possible responses, and he would use whichever one was given to gauge the Lord's will in the whole enterprise. The procedure bears some resemblance to Gideon's test with the fleece, Judges 6:36 through 40, but it wholly lacks the timidity and doubt that spurred the bid for reassurance. Jonathan simply did not want to run ahead of God's leading. As Jonathan explained to his companion, if the Philistines told them to wait for their men to come down to them, they would not proceed any further. Note that Jonathan did not say they would turn tail and run. He may have expected a fight even then, but from his next statement, it appears that he did not consider this option to be the favorable one. How the episode might have turned out if the enemy had opted for this course is anyone's guess. The alternative was simplicity personified. If the Philistines challenged the two men to come up to them, they would go up. But as simple as this action appears on the surface, there is more to it underneath. Jonathan was not really basing his course of action on what the Philistines wanted. He was trusting that their invitation was a sign from the Lord, an invitation from him to go up and fight the enemy. If the Philistines called for Jonathan and his servant to climb up to their position, it would clearly not be for a social gathering. They would have a quick death in mind for the two men. We are not told how many soldiers were manning the garnish, but they certainly outnumbered the two Israelites by a considerable margin. It would hardly be a fair fight, but it held the prospect of great sport for a company of men sitting around a lonely outpost and hungry for action. That was how things looked on the human level, but Jonathan did not see it that way. He looked beyond what is seen and discerned the Lord's hand in the situation. A Philistine call to come up the cliff would indeed be a death summons, but it would backfire on the challengers. The enemy would be signing their own death warrant, for by their challenge the Lord would deliver them into the hands of his two servants. That was the eye of faith that Jonathan exercised. The taunting Philistine threat would be the very sign from God that he sought. It would be the green light he was waiting for, and he had full confidence that he could rely on it without regret. How different this is from the ordinary human reaction. When faced with opposition and ridicule, most of us take it as our cue to retreat, to abandon our plans we may have had for advancing God's kingdom, to stay home and be silent. While Jonathan's faith and the actions it led to is not a call for us to pick fights with those who oppose us, it does throw a stern light on our parchment for avoiding all conflict, especially on a spiritual level, of a spiritual nature. The truth is, we are in a spiritual war whether we want to be or not. And the other primary way to avoid being a casualty in that conflict is to take God's word to heart so firmly that we act on it, come what may. Satan will throw everything he has against us, but God has infinitely more to throw back. The question is, do we believe him enough to take our part in the battle? A conclusive victory. Verse 11. And both of them discovered themselves into the garnish of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, Behold, the Hebrews come forth out of the holes where they had hid themselves. Verse 12. And the men of the garnish answered Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, Come up to us, and we will show you a thing. And Jonathan said unto his armor bearer, Come up after me, for the Lord have delivered them into the hands of Israel. Verse 13. And Jonathan climbed up upon his hands and upon his feet, and his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer slew after him. The enemy challenge. 1 Samuel 14:11 through 12a. The Philistine response was exactly as Jonathan had hoped. When the two men moved out into the open and allowed themselves to be seen, the garnish erupted in derision. Look, the Hebrews have crawled out of the holes they were hiding in, was the gist of their taunt. The statement of scorn was immediately followed by the invitation Jonathan was waiting for. Come up to us and we will show you a thing. Verse 2. The iron blow of faith. 1 Samuel 14:12b through 13. The derisive challenge of the Philistines held no intimidation for Jonathan. Their words were music to his ears, the clinching sign from the Lord. He told his armor bearer to stay right behind him as they ascended the cliff. So Jonathan ascended the cliff with his armor bearer right behind him. Both hands and feet were fully occupied in the effort of climbing, which ostensibly would have made them easy targets for the enemy. The natural expected result of their operation would be a quick demise, but that did not happen. When the two reached the top, they immediately engaged the surprised Philistines and had a field day killing enemy soldiers right and left. The hand of God was on these two men who trusted him in the venture. They trusted him enough to stake their lives on it, and he honored their faith. The verse beyond our text, 1 Samuel 14:14, tells us that Jonathan and his servant dispatched some 20 enemy soldiers that day. Perhaps a few escaped, just enough to spread panic in the enemy camp. Verse 15. Soon the Israelite army saw a strange sight. The vast Philistine army melting away in full retreat. Verse 16. This was all because one man had faith in God's power and acted on it. Questions. 1. What suggestion did Jonathan make to his armor bearer? 2. Where was Saul at this time? 3. What is emphasized with regard to Jonathan's plan? 4. How did the terrain present a particular challenge in getting close to the Philistine outpost? 5. What was Jonathan hoping for in checking out the enemy garnishing? 6. Why did Jonathan say it may be in looking for God's help against the enemy? 1 Samuel 14:6. 7. How did the armor bearer respond to Jonathan's request? 8. How was Jonathan planning to use the enemy response? 9. What did the Philistines' derisive challenge signify to Jonathan? 10. How did two men succeed against the vastly superior numbers? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, June 20th, 2021. Thank you for listening. God bless.